Last time the three of us had this conversation, we were in Venice in beautiful weather with like Prosecco flowing and all of that, in the basement of the British Pavilion, talking about an exhibition which was upstairs. And now we're in Milton Keynes talking about an exhibition which is still in Venice. So you'll have to forgive us talking about an exhibition that you mainly probably haven't seen. But the reason it's interesting to do it here, of course, is the evidence, the very material fact of what these guys made their show about is all around us, and Milton Keynes being one of the cardinal examples in the show, and we'll have a lot of chat about that. Before they're going to get into it by starting with a bit of a description of what it was and setting up the project, and then I'm going to ask a few questions as we go along. But we're sort of hoping to make this into a bit of a conversation. I think it's important to know who you are. Can I ask, first of all, because it's obviously the elephant in the room, who here worked for Milton Keynes Development Corporation?
Oh my God.
That's quite a lot of people. So you can fact check the guys as we go along. Who here is an architect, let's say, architect, designer, kind of professionally engaged with this world? Who here is not? And what do you guys do? What's your professional background? Wow.
From the City Discovery Center. I was in Venice.
Great. And yeah, who saw it in Venice? Did anyone see it in Venice? A couple of people. Okay, great. So that very specialised group of the audience, we don't want it to be too internal a conversation, but it would be great to hear from you later about some of the conclusions that these guys drew. But maybe I'll hand over to Sam to sort of set up what this project was all about.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Thanks, Kieran. Well, I mean, I'm going to talk a little bit about the context of Venice, because we started with a brief from the director of the Biennale, who was asking really the national pavilions to look at what happened to modernism in country X, country Y, whatever. And that, for us, sparked a much more interesting question, which was really to do with what is modernity in Britain, especially in a country where we have a really, I think, problematic relationship with architecture, with design, with the idea of modernism, yet is a place which has experienced incredible waves of modernity. And so that seemed to us to be one of the kind of interesting starting points, which is really when did modernity begin, and what was it, and how did people react to it, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. What we wanted to do was tell a story which spanned an incredible period of time. And we did that with the title as well. The show's called A Clockwork Jerusalem. Clockwork from, Kubrick's film, A Clockwork Orange, and Jerusalem from William Blake's Jerusalem. And this was important, I think, because it was really, for us, William Blake was really the origin of a response to the Industrial Revolution. And we claim that the first appearance of the text which became Jerusalem is the foundation text of British modernity, which is very different, I think, to thinking of modernism with a capital M as a sort of continental, kind of art historical kind of culture. This is something very different. It's 100 years earlier, and it's half insane and incredibly religious, and you can see it here. It's like satanic mills, fire and brimstone in the background. A very, very different vision of what modernism might be.
What we found also fascinating, really modernist about it, is that it's not just a religious vision, but it's a religious vision based on the very early stages of industrialization. The dark satanic mills cause Blake to dream of this other city. So you could say that modernism actually starts with a critique of the actual city that he sees developing around him. So many times modernism is completely joined to or seen in parallel to industrialization, but in fact it is joined to it, but as a kind of you could say nearly an allergic reaction to it.
And then this was important too. Obviously, here's the poster for Kubrick's Clockwork Orange. And some of you may recognize the poster next to it, which which was a poster produced, drawn by an illustrator called Philip Castle, titled Leisure in Milton Keynes. Beautiful airbrushed image. It's the same artist who made both of these posters. And this, I think, was like a kind of a spark that flew across a synapse. It was almost like a kind of punchline of a joke. We thought, oh my God, there is something here that connects the world of planning, the world of the planning of new towns, and wider cultural ideas.
And honestly, we didn't know. We knew that we were going to talk about A Clockwork Orange because of the scenes in Thamesmead. We knew that we were going to talk about Milton Keynes. The poster of Milton Keynes was actually from, I have a little personal story from when I was a child. My parents had a book called Utopias, and this picture was in it, and I always knew it. And then after we had decided to develop a concept for Venice, only then did we find out that these two images were made by the same artist. That was our religious research. Our epiphany. Yeah, that was our research.
So what we were trying to do is tell an incredibly broad story, both historically, but also in terms of what it might connect to. Often you think of architecture and planning, it's thought of or it's practiced as something actually quite separate from the rest of the world. We felt it was very important to tell a story that showed the connection between half hallucinating artists like William Blake, successful airbrush artists from the 1970s, as well as the celebrated architects and planners who were part of the story of the manufacturing of a new vision of Britain from, I guess, Howard to the new towns.
So this kind of trajectory, I mean, I said at the time and still think it's kind of a grand revisionist history in some ways to what we might think of orthodox descriptions of modernism being about industrial materials, about a certain aesthetic, about kind of destroying cities in favor of kind of slabs of concrete. This was an attempt to recover it as part of a popular project. The facade of the building, I mean, it's obviously incredibly relevant to talk about that here. You treated this portico, this is the British Pavilion in Venice, for those of you who haven't been. So every year in Venice, this is occupied by a British artist, one year, architect the next, and given the job of representing Britain at the Biennale. Why did you reconfigure the facade in this way with the two cows and then the artwork in the portico?
Well, we borrowed two of your concrete cows. We shipped them over. They went on a barge down the Grand Canal, and now they stand centrally either side of this incredibly symmetrical kind of building. So, these concrete cows, which come out of a kind of community arts project, are now standing there as though they were Venetian lions. They assume the same kind of significance, which we felt was an important gesture partly because they have been the butt of popular national joke for decades, and here they are given a much grander kind of position, and that was very important.
Did people know what they were? Did visitors say, because visitors from all over the world come to Venice, did they have any clue about these concrete cows? Did they immediately identify them, or did they say, what is this strange?
They certainly liked them.
Right, they liked them a lot. Yeah.
That's good. And are they back? When are you giving them back?
Well, they are coming back, yeah. They should be back by Christmas. They said that about the First World War, didn't they?
And this wasn't the only thing. I mean, also in the portico, you can't quite see it in this image, but you had an artwork. It's close to the house.
That's an electrical horse, and one of the things that we found very fascinating there was a number of issues of architectural design dedicated to the planning and the design of Milton Keynes, and some of the stuff in there had never been realized, and one of our favorite images was this one, and this was an idea by the architect, by the designers, that buildings could actually also be accessorized, you could say, with electrical facades, and also that the buildings could become messages or messaging boards. And there were different. There was one with that you could project messages on the trees of Milton Keynes through these cassettes to beam light through it, and you could have neon lights, and then you would have just this kind of board with light bulbs going on and off, and you could have this animated white horse. And we found that incredibly interesting because at the same time, the Milton Keynes planning seemed to want to dissolve the entire city in greenery, that the buildings would actually disappear behind the trees. At the same time, they seemed to also want to make some of the buildings dissolve into light and electricity and messages. And which is why we also called this room the electric pastoral, because it was this kind of double dream of planning in the 60s to dissolve the city in the green or to turn it into a big television. And
both those,
we recreated the left one.
Right, yeah, you recreated this animation,
which
was very beautiful, by the way. But that kind of entry really situated your story in a context of popular things. You know, these were graphical, they were adornments, these are not works of architecture as such. But when you walked in the door, and you can just see it, this was the door saying Great Britain over the door, there was this pile of earth, a much more mysterious object. What on earth, as it were, was this?
Well, it does relate a little bit to the White Horse as well. Thinking of the White Horse as some kind of 1970s kind of high-tech version of the Neolithic white horse of the English landscape. And in some senses, what we were always trying to do was to talk about the way in which, certainly we felt, that British modernism often looked backwards in order to go forwards. And so the mound became a figure, a very important figure, and it came from really looking at a series of projects. First of all, obviously in Arnold Circus, the Boundary Estate, blah, 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 down here, where here you can see the slum of the notorious old nickel slum being torn down. You can see the rubble being piled up into the centre of this new planned social housing estate, one of the first social housing projects in the world. And that rubble of the slum was used to form the centrepiece, which is this park, which is light and space and greenery and publicness, which is almost the opposite of the slum. So this is the sort of turn of the century, like kind of 1900 essentially. And symbolically, that seemed to us to be a very sort of beautiful idea. First of all, it was the ruins of the slum which became the new world, but also there are echoes of, you know, the burial mound or Silbury Hill, or these kinds of very ancient forms of structure. And the mound we see reoccurring in so many other projects in Robin Hood Gardens.
Well, I was going to ask you about Robin Hood Gardens because, of course, the quote, it seems to be most closely related to that mound, at least in its scale somehow. I mean, it's probably smaller than Robin Hood. Robin Hood Gardens is an estate in East London designed by Alison and Peter Smithson, which it was in the exhibition, wasn't it?
Yeah,
of course.
Yeah.
And is at the moment in danger of being torn down. So it's a current location of strife in terms of Britain dealing with modernity and modernism.
But, yeah, it's funny that Robin Hood Gardens was the mound in Robin Hood Gardens was also filled with the rubble of the slum that came before it, and now of course Robin Hood Garden is seen to be a new slum. So these mounds also speak about this kind of circular aspect of history, that it's this constant kind of cannibalization, nearly, of that the last century's utopia could be next century's slum again, and that things go on and on. But at the same time, the mounds nearly detach themselves from that kind of history, and they become a kind of image of at the same kind of optimism to the future, but at the same time this deep kind of nearly subconscious level of collective subconscious of the British landscape.
I mean, while the rest of the show is in some ways quite straightforward in its material, you know, this is the only room that you might call an installation. Most of it is stuff on the wall and stuff in cases. This is really where you get that part of your story, which is about the kind of somehow mysterious and, you know, even spiritual roots, not normally associated with quite a lot of modernist architecture. It's seen as rational, it's seen as number crunching, but you've really recast that in the context of Neolithic collective subconscious. I mean, why did you want to sort of bring to the fore that aspect?
Well, it also has something to do with, I think, the exaltation. The exaltation is always a part of modernist architecture and modern planning, but also this century, of this past century of modernism. There's, whether that is the exaltation of William Blake, the exalted William Blake, or the exalted Cliff Richard, who
We're going to come to Cliff.
We'll come to Cliff a little bit later, I suppose. Actually, the director of the Biennale, an old Italian politician and intellectual called Paolo Baratta. He said of the show, and I thought that was very right on, he said, it's like you've put English architecture on the couch, and these are all the kind of dreams and fears that come out of it. So it's not just mysterious, you could also call it psychoanalytic.
So this is architecture's fear of becoming a mound of rubble.
Yes, yeah. Well, it's the mother.
Well, it was also a kind of challenge. You know, that this is also a burial mound, and I think it's the whole story was a story about planning, but it was a story about visionary planning, which often entailed incredible amounts of hard technical work, but that came from in a really imaginative place. And I think that's something which seems to be markedly different from approaches now. And so in some senses, this is a challenge. Like, this is where the imaginative history of British planning, you know, has been buried. And we see here Peter Cook of Archigram throwing some of the earth from Robin Hood Gardens onto the burial mound. Little did he know he was participating in a burial ceremony.
For himself.
Exactly.
Talk about digging your own grave.
Yeah. But around this mound was a kind of narrative, gigantic frieze, which tells essentially the story which we were interested in. It begins with Silbury Hill, and it includes the Industrial Revolution. It includes Joseph Gandhi. It includes the burning of Newgate Prison, so sort of civil unrest in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution.
And a member of that mob burning Newgate Prison was the young William Blake himself,
who rises from the smoke of the burning prison.
Yeah.
We see destruction of the Blitz, new homes rising from the rubble, kind of modernity in its sort of full force kicking in with motorways and
Cliff Richard's teeth.
Cliff Richard's hair,
prominently.
Teeth. But we also see this endless return. So this is a story about Hume, which we could tell now, which is actually quite a good example of the way in which we wanted to cite history as an important aspect of how Britain manufactures its future. So this is a story which begins with Stonehenge, you know, the kind of mysterious, unknown origin of British architecture, of which there's been a tremendous amount of speculation, UFOs,
Romans,
giants, or in this case, Inigo Jones, assuming or wanting it to be a Roman temple. So this is Inigo Jones's drawing of Stonehenge, made incredibly regular, as though he imagined Romans would have manufactured Stonehenge.
But then with the awful British weather, you know what happened.
Yeah. Now, this is the Royal Crescent in Bath, the finest piece of set piece of Georgian urban planning. Palladian in style, so descendant of Inigo Jones in some senses. But John Wood the Elder, who planned both the Royal Crescent and the circus, a big fan of paganism, lived obviously in the West Country and loved the landscapes of Neolithic Britain, and explicitly talks about the Royal Crescent as forming the inner circle of Stonehenge. And you see an intersection of...
And he made also one of his jobs was also to draw the monuments, right?
Yeah.
So he also made a very, very exact, a much more precise measurement and reconstruction of Stonehenge while he was planning Bath.
So this is an invention of a new typology for a new era, the sort of rise of the middle class, which suddenly leaps backwards in time. And this intersection of...
Interesting thing is John Wood said that if British architecture has two pillars, one is Stonehenge and the other is Palladio.
Yeah.
So, and then you get Bath.
And then, of course, moving forwards again and jumping hundreds of years, this is the Hume Estates in Manchester, whose architects explicitly referenced the Royal Crescent and created these four gigantic crescent blocks, which were in some ways a very simple statement about democracy and welfare states and so on. If the Royal Crescent is one of the most perfect examples of places to live in England, or how to live in England, why couldn't that work for thousands of people rather than 11 families?
Yeah.
And so this kind of multiplication of the crescent, the Bath Crescent, the Royal Crescent for all, essentially.
And also the Hume Estate, which was then the largest housing estate in Britain until then, was built again on a landscape which formerly held the area called Hume, which was one of the worst slums in British 19th century Manchester, which was also described by Engels. He wrote in the condition of the English working class, he specifically describes Hume as the ultimate kind of scandal of British housing conditions in the 19th century. So this is also, to then have Palladio, Stonehenge and modernism to kind of escape from that scandal. That is what Hume. So Hume was probably one of the most monumental examples of optimism and modernism that you could find.
One of the things that also fell from grace so spectacularly fast, due to an accident. It basically meant that the families who were living there petitioned the council to be rehoused, and they were, which meant that Hume became a place for people without families, which meant that it became full of young people, which meant that it then became a very different kind of place to that which was envisaged by its architects and by its clients. It became this kind of place. This is a photograph by Kevin Cummins of the band Joy Division, standing on the bridge into Hume in 1979. So by the time Hume had become essentially a new kind of bohemian squat / slum.
And the show goes into quite a lot of detail about Hume, this other life of Hume, not directed by architects, not suggested as part of the programming of the building, but, sort of community events and, this kind of stuff. I mean, I think I asked you in Venice, I'll ask you again, are you trying to make excuses for the failure of some of these things? Because they were real failures, some of the buildings. I mean, one can't generalize about modernism, but some of these buildings were kind of out of scale. They didn't contain the kind of social life that the streets had contained. All of the orthodox critiques of modernism. Are you trying to avoid that critique, or do you think this trumps that? What's your take?
We're trying to rewire it, I think, because those discussions, I think, have been plaguing British architecture for 40 years, if not longer. I think that the polarization of discussions about modernism have been incredibly damaging to the possibilities of what architecture and planning can do. And it's still talked about, it's still policy exchange, still come up with ideas that we should blow up tower blocks because tower blocks are the reason why Britain is broken. It's like absolutely insane, I would say. But equally insane has been architect's response, forced into a corner, have had to argue for modernism against Poundbury's being built across the country. And so that polarization, I think, is the problem. So the revisionist history is an attempt to write a kind of different story, a kind of story that weaves through. Like, there is a story which is, you could say about Hume, is that it was a total failure, demolished 19 years after it was built. Here it is, full of community life, but full of people not paying any rent and very few of them working and so on. But Hume is also the birthplace of a new vision of Manchester, the vision of Manchester which is now home to part of the BBC and all of that kind of youth culture of factory records gave it its post-industrial future. So in some senses, you could see it as a longer-term success.
Yeah.
That something came out of that imaginative inhabitation of the ruins of another vision.
But of course it is a discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, for you, Sam, being a British architect, practicing architect, trying to make, I completely sympathise. I also write about architecture and, it's difficult to make the case sometimes in Britain for a certain kind of idiom of architecture, and you can see that encampment. But Wouter, you're from Holland. Aren't you all sort of, there's a much more orthodox, modern society, made of modern architecture mainly. What's your interest in this alternative history?
At the same time, in Holland, you see exactly the same thing happening. I mean, the past, until the financial crisis, I must say, there has been a kind of an orgy, nearly, of demolition projects where also modernist high-rises in Holland have been demolished. Also, many times, they also did contain very, very high concentrations of crime and unemployment, etc. And in Holland, we have had the same kind of discussions, maybe not as ideological as they seem in England, but I think we take a more, you could say, more stoical look at history of these places, because what you can see happening in Hume is that in Hume and many thousands examples all over Europe you can find of these large housing estates that somehow the original economic or political system that created them, that system has kind of evaporated. But still, these buildings stand there, and then these buildings acquire whole new demographies, new uses. Sometimes these buildings can absorb that well, and sometimes they cannot. And all that story is not. There are no architects involved in that story, not anymore. It's the afterlife, or you could say the real life of these buildings.
Yeah.
And I think, and the strange thing is. These buildings are, in many of these ideological discussions, still treated as if there still is a serious possibility that we will build them again or not. We will, in a way, these buildings are history. We will never build them again, that's for sure. There might be some very small factions in these discussions that say we have to start building brutalist buildings for thousands of people, social housing units again, but it's very, very, very small. So these buildings have become history. They have become, they're being treated like Palladio again. They have become, some of them have become historical landmarks. And some of them have become ruins and are being re-inhabited by other people. And I think to look at them as ruins from a past era gives us much more freedom to deal with them. We don't look in that way at medieval architecture, like we should demolish it all because it's all feudal. We don't say that about Venice, like let's demolish it because it's by these fascist dogs who conquered Crete or something. We don't do that. So why are we getting still so worked up about these buildings that are just there? And that doesn't mean that our position is of conservationists, but sometimes yes, sometimes no. But I think we should accept them for what they are, places where people live in. And sometimes the people don't want to live there, and then we should do something about it, and sometimes they do. You know, it's...
In the show, there is a tangible enjoyment, though, of some of this architecture and the visual culture around it. And I wonder whether you might talk about some of your recovery of some of the stylistic sort of aspects of these buildings, the graphic design around it, the films, what is it about connecting those things that's so radical in an architectural biennale? I mean,
well, let's look at this example. So here we're looking at two pieces of propaganda, wartime propaganda. The first, a poster by one of a sequence by Abram Gaines, Your Britain, Fight for It Now, sent to the troops to encourage the troops to imagine why they're fighting, what they will come home to. And here you see Finsbury Health Centre, and then you see the dilapidated slums of the industrial city, and you see this modernist future. This is health, there was one for education, one for housing. But didn't find favour with Churchill, who withdrew them and commissioned a set by...
Much better. Yeah.
Do we have a vote? Can I have a vote? Because this is a competition. Which one do you prefer? Come on, like which Britain would you fight for? Can I have a show of hands for this one? A remarkably low turnout, and a show of hands for this one. The pastor, Churchill was right. So.
Yeah. But I think this is interesting because it's actually what we found was that actually these two visions are not so different after all. The idea of the pastoral, the idea of the landscape is so embedded in British culture that it's inescapable, even when the future you're trying to build is one of a kind of socialist welfare state with modernist kind of design principles. And you can see that, for example, in terms of this image of the ruin, let's say. So we were interested in the real ruins created by war, so the bombing of cities, but also the fact that that was seen as something positive, or that there was something positive within them. So this is an amazing pamphlet celebrating essentially the destruction of cities, celebrating because the bombs that fall on the city bring something which had been impossible to bring to the industrial city, which is light and space. It may have been in the most violent and destructive way possible, but it makes the image on the right-hand side possible.
And makes very ironic Prince Charles's later famous sort of statement about that modernism did more damage to the city than the Luftwaffe. It was already presaged in that very poster.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I come from Rotterdam, and of course Rotterdam was nearly the world capital of how do you say, using a bombardment to develop the city. And what you see in Rotterdam, as you see it in London, that before the bombs fell, the central city of Rotterdam were already trying to demolish large parts of it. So when the bombs fell, they could not have fallen at a better moment, because that was then all the plans were there. But the people who wanted to demolish large parts of this old city, they were still having to battle huge administrative barriers. And then the bombs fell, and everything could be just rolled out. So in a way, when the bombs fell also on London, they did not fall on infertile ground. There were already schemes and ideas and visions of a much more open city. Because the interesting thing of that image that Sam just showed, the booklet, the page before it actually talks about the other advantage offered by airplanes, which is aerial photography. aerial photography allows you to look at a city from above and then to imagine and to measure how it might be laid out much better and much more rationally. So aerial photography plus aerial bombardments together, they can form and inspiring cities that are inspiring to look and live in.
And in the most inspiring lithographic prints too.
Yeah.
I mean, the image you were just showing that was on the screen there, Sam, I mean, it's slightly different idiom, but this could be from a beetle, it could be from Yellow Submarine. I mean, it's an extraordinary image.
This is the 51 Festival of Britain, Lansbury Estate, which is a kind of living exhibition of planning, essentially. So a satellite of the South Bank Festival of Britain. You could go on a bus out to Poplar, where you would see some temporary exhibits, but also you would see some new homes which had been built from out of London's ruins. And I think it's a very evocative image. But the ruins are very real, and the ruins maybe were necessary in some sense, to pull down the slum, to make that rubble into something else. But the ruin is also such a strong figure in the British psyche. This is Joseph Gandy, illustration of John Soane's Bank of England in ruins, one of a series of paintings which Soane and Gandy produced to show their client, the Bank of England. Here, this is what your building will look like. And of course, it's an incredible perversity on the one hand, but of course ties into that whole era of the grand tour, of the sort of picturesque landscape, where the ruin becomes such a significant figure, romanticism, the sublime, etc., etc. And I think that's something which is not, so the ruin is both an imaginative possibility as well as a real problem simultaneously. And I think it's something that you see in those grand projects of the era. This is the sketches for the Barbican, sketches by Nora Glover, which I think are incredibly suggestive of a Piranesian type space. It's a Piranesian version of modernism, which is overblown. It's almost theatrical in its rustication. The architects that we talked to who worked on the Barbican were obsessed with its texture.
And you had casts of those textures in the show, didn't you?
We did, yeah. As though, just like Soane has casts of, the Parthenon, we had casts of the texture, the rustication of the Barbican.
But there's also another thing that we found interesting of the Gandhi painting. If you look at it from a Hollywood screenwriter's point of view, what does this image imply? Gandhi and Soane are still working on the. This is like the rendering, the rendering of the building when you're still designing it, and then they choose to imagine. So they're building this building in London in the late 18th century. And then they are imagining imagining a future state in which London and that building lies in ruins, and then they look back. So so in fact it's science fiction, this painting, because they imagine a future London where the building that is not even finished when they are painting it lies in ruins. And then what kind of society do you imagine living there? How does that future society look back at the society you are working in? And in a way we connected that to some other famous protagonists of British modernism, like William Morris's
So here, yeah, News from
Nowhere, where and this is a very interesting book. The way that the screenwriting of this book, it's amazing that nobody ever turned it into a movie. Is that William Morris was present at a large riot on Trafalgar Square. Then himself, and the real William Morris, then imagines how riots could break out in England and destroy destroy the whole society as it is, because it's unlivable, the England of the middle 19th century, so unequal, so large scale, so inhuman, so industrial, etc. And he imagines that these riots would completely destroy the England as it was in the 19th century, and then he imagines a time 100 years later, 1952, around the Festival of Britain. Then he imagines that how Britain in 1952 would look, and the Britain of 1952 would be a complete kind of a pre-Raphaelite utopia, where people would again live in small villages, and there would be no money, there would be no power, there would be no education, no law, because people would just live in such a way together that all those things would not be needed. And sometimes, of course, you have ruins of this 19th century Britain. And this, for us, this is typical for utopian and modernist thinking, that in a way it looks forward in order to be able to imagine backward, and vice versa. It's always a kind of, it's funny, because of course in modernist cliche is that nostalgia is about the worst thing that you can accuse anyone of. But in fact, there's something deeply nostalgia is a very important tool in imagining utopia.
And obviously this kind of romantic science fiction idiom becomes important in the show, but I think you even pushed it a bit further than that, didn't you? You looked to projects that were using some pretty interesting attempts at finding a deeper truth. It wasn't just nostalgia, it wasn't just politics, it was people arranging cities around orientations of the sun or of ley lines and of these kinds of, searching for, in a true romantic vein, a deeper truth, a deeper motivation.
In some ways, yeah. I mean, we've talked a little bit about Stonehenge and the Royal Crescent and Hume, but it's also true here in Milton Keynes. With Derek Walker, he was sort of anecdotally telling me, one weekend we redesigned the sewage works because, well, the one which had been designed was crap, but also they wanted to put it on a ley line, and what, on a ley line? He was going, yes, we were into some very kinky things in those days. And,
we can find out if that's true in a minute.
The idea that somewhere which on the one hand has an incredibly rational form of planning, but could also connect to these almost irrational, mythical things. I mean, ley lines don't actually exist, do they?
It's in the nature of myths that we don't know.
Certainly kinky.
Well, are they kinky? My question, I think, one of my questions about this group of works is how sincere you guys really are about how far do you really push it? Because you either believe that there's some value in ritual and that many of these designers were paying close attention to some very deep sort of, let's say, eternal or universal meanings from nature, or you believe that that was a kind of narrative meant to justify what they wanted to do anyway.
I think what fascinates me and fascinated me about the story that we were telling was not that they were sincere, but was the fact that they tried to combine things which seem almost impossible to combine. So let's take another example of one of the projects we looked at, the Cumbernauld. On the one hand, Cumbernauld, here, an image produced by Geoffrey Copcutt, the designer of Cumbernauld Town Centre, a huge megastructural project, all cast in concrete, described by Copcutt explicitly on the one hand as an open citadel, and on the other hand as a drive-in vending machine. And this is designed
late 50s.
Yeah. At the moment where you also see in kind of wider culture, sort of beginning of pop art, for example, independent group, you see sort of interest in things like this. This comes a little bit later from a New Society issue on non-plan, which was Peter Hall, Cedric Price, Rayner Banham, and Paul Barker. But this kind of roadside Americana, this also part of non-plan, but this kind of fascination with the technology of an experience of a kind of new consumer culture and post-austerity and so on that promised so much. But at the same time, for Kopka, was also combined with this obsession with archaeology and his particular interest in the of Knossos.
Minoan.
And you can all, as soon as you begin to look at a plan like this through the lens of Cumberland, you go, oh my God, actually, this is a megastructure. So you have this thing which is, on the one hand, incredibly ancient, and on the other hand, is incredibly modern. It's not something which is trying to be, Minoan, and it's something where these two sort of traditions or two ideas intersect. And I think for me,
but they intersect in quite a kind of, almost like a postmodern way. I mean, they just pluck them and crash them together rather than actually saying, we're working out of the deepest roots of Western architecture in the Palace of Knossos in some kind of continuity. This is about taking what fits and using that, like in the case of your first image, enjoying the chaos, the image with the signs, enjoying the chaos of the intersection of commerce, of design, of technology, and so on.
But you talked about sincerity. What I think that these things show is that architecture and urban planning are actually in the very, very first place that they are social. That we are talking about a social technology or a social discipline. That means, and actually what they are. And of course, the whole narrative of modernism has become that modernism was all about functionalism and functionality and modernization, etc. But what you can see happening is, I'm calling it social because you can see a kind of attempt at creating the stories that we might organize our world around us with. So there's this grasping for new images that come from America or that are inspired by America, but there's also the images that are equally exotic, that come from the Mediterranean antiquity. There's a constant, so if we say, did they really mean that, or are they just using these images to sell something, or is it just propaganda? I don't think that's the real question, because to use images in order to sell it means that these architects, they were part of a huge national conversation that happened partially in the exchange of images and also the fantasizing about how the future of the nation would be. So we see and that maybe also explains the slight craziness of some of the images, that they were all attempts of creating or finding out how the world might look like. That's why. So we're that's our. I'm not sure if that comes out, but at least we were totally unrealistic about it.
Yeah. No, I mean that definitely comes through. I'm wondering, while some of these great films play. So just describe what this is, because this is extraordinary.
This is a concrete and clay, unit 4+2. There's 5 of them.
We saw them live.
Oh my God.
This one was called
So they're in their kind of Beatles suits in front of the Barbican building site.
Yeah.
What are they singing about?
Singing about concrete and clay, and about romance, and I guess a sense of belief
in concrete.
Well, the concrete and they are part of the way of believing.
Yeah.
They are symbolic.
And it's also about how their romantic feelings or their feelings of loss, etc., or lust, perhaps, that they somehow connect to the city that they are moving through. You know, the city that is also coming up. So the city is the kind of the vessel in which they have all these.
And it's interesting that they kind of put next to each other the two archetypal materials of the British city, kind of baked earth, thin bricks, and then concrete as a kind of equivalent.
Grey liquid.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any evidence that they are on the side of one of the big post-war reconstruction projects. I think it's absolutely kind of logical why they should be there, and why ideas of desire, ideas of love, ideas of these very intangible kinds of ideas are embedded in the proposals themselves. They're embedded in the Barbican. It comes out of things like desire. It's certainly not a rational project.
Speaking of which, the other film you, of course, have to show because it's featuring Milton Keynes, and perhaps I'd like to open it up to you guys for some questions or even thoughts, particularly, I presume most of you live in or around this extraordinary set piece of evidence, but this was a great hit in Venice. And I'm wondering if for you guys, this audience, this is just an old saw. You've seen this a million times, and it's exhausting and just boring, or whether it gives you that sense of, like it did, I think, for the audience in Venice, the sense of the incredible optimism, the incredible kind of modernity, cutting-edge modernity of this place. But you better describe what it is. I mean, you know what this is. Right?
Well, this is the funny thing. The reason, of course, the reason was for playing it or using it was that it played in the then very brand new Milton Keynes shopping center. But the other thing is that it's the first time Sony Walkman was presented in such a huge way because it had just come out. The Sony Walkman, which was an absolute. I remember it too. I think I was 12 when it came out, and I specifically got a paper round in order to buy one, which was weird because the paper rounds are the best way to use them. But the Sony electric the Sony Walkman kind of was also nearly already prophesized by people in the 60s. By this idea of, you could have the gadget, Rainer Bannon, this great theorist of modern architecture, he wrote about how electronic gadgets would reach a certain scale of smallness, miniaturization, that you wouldn't need cities anymore because you would carry all these kinds of things around with you. You could have houses that would just consist of a bubble with a technological corridor. The bubble could just float around on a wild landscape. So in a way, of course, this is a strange disco period of Sir Cliff.
And he really can roller skate, which is the biggest.
He really can. But on the other hand, it is also, you can see how these strange archigram-like ideas of architectural futures, that they in a certain period, that they could come very close to actual popular culture and to the actual economy, to the actual technology of the time, and that it really was a shared kind of imagination, modernity, that it really was.
It's quite hard to concentrate on Wouter while these lycra-clad roller skaters are on the screen, but I wonder if I could take some points of thoughts or questions from the floor, especially if they're Cliff Richard related. But,
Is anyone who's not Cliff Richard related at all, but as somebody who actually lives and sells Milton Keynes on a daily basis, I would like to pay you guys a really big compliment. When I arrived at the Pavilion, it was almost like arriving home, walking through the concrete cows, through the trees, which you haven't explained, the tree trunks, seeing the shopping centre, the horse image, walking in accidentally. You didn't show the other side of the wall, which is on the right-hand side, but it shows Campbell Park and the Secular Mound. I thought it was the Secular Mound. Everything is obviously from a Milton Keynes perspective, but you really captured the essence of it. And on the first day when we did the talk downstairs, I didn't get a chance to, I had to go back the next day to actually look at it again, to actually absorb all of it. But you really captured the essence of Milton Keynes, and not just the modernism, but also, I think, to a certain extent, the essence of what makes modernism work for people, and that it's consumable, which is user-friendly. And this is where, Milton Keynes is very unique. We joke about the concrete cows, and it's a bit like Clockwork Orange and things, and I'll say that. It's like Marmite, you either like it or understand it, or you don't. And the Clockwork Orange had a lot of social messages, obviously, but that poster, had the same but opposite message of hope and, future vision. So I really want to pay you guys a compliment there. One or two little things, because you don't live in Milton Keynes, which I won't mention here, but
I'm sure the corrections can come thick and fast.
I will say that I really enjoyed it. I had to go back on the second day to look at it again. And I'm actually quite glad to see somebody else is there. But also going to one of the other pavilions, British Pavilion was almost the most easy one to understand and got the message across the best, in my opinion. There are very few others who actually captured modernity and the essence of the architecture and the livability of it. So
a high compliment indeed.
Thank you.
Anybody else who's got a thought or a question for the guys, or come on, there must be loads. Don't be shy. Does anyone think they got it wrong? This is a revisionist history too far. Some of you guys were in this history at the time.
We can still revise it.
Yeah, we can revise it again.
So if you have suggestions.
if you don't like these principles, they have others.
One of the things about Milton Keynes is you've got this essence of its Britishness, sort of the William Blake, the Clockwork connection. But in putting the exhibition together, the international perspective, where modernism wasn't confined just to the issues, and there was a whole series of discussions going on in North America, and the building of Detroit, or the creation of new cities in South America, and growth on a massive scale. How much of that did you pick up? Was it relevant?
That's interesting. Britain was exporting architectural ideas, wasn't it, at this time?
Well, we were very selective in that, so not a lot of that came in, but one place came through very, very strongly, and that is Los Angeles, or California, because we also found out how not just how people like Peter Hall and Rainer Banham, Cedric Price, just before and during the first phases of the planning of Milton Keynes, but also Llewellyn Davis, the original planner, that I think Peter Hall even described it as a kind of a Saul Paul conversion, that when he first saw how the Californian urban landscape, this kind of incredibly relaxed grid of cars, etc., that they underwent nearly a kind of a conversion. So this type of, this type of, that we don't need this kind of incredibly tight hierarchies of new town planning that came before, that this enjoyment, this looseness, could also be kind of adapted to the English landscape, and so and of course the interest in car culture was of course America inspired, and of course it was only we have to, and that's also interesting for us to imagine now that this is a time when the cultural pessimism about America was not as strong then as it is now. So that America and California were still very positive images. And there's specifically one guy, I think he's also called, I don't know in which document, but the Milton Keynes people, planners, called him, one of the great influences was Melvin Webber, the great traffic planner of San Francisco, who said we don't need transit-oriented planning, or that's an anachronism, but like to organize a whole town around the railway station, we could have little buses and little taxis, and we could have public planning or public transport on a much looser way, and to create a much looser landscape, much more about the freedom of the inhabitants to say, I'm going to do my grocery there or there, I don't I'm not condemned by the form of the city to always go to the neighborhood center, etc. It's kind of the dissolution of this hierarchical planning.
I mean,
that was inspired by California. That's one of the things that does come through.
Yeah, that definitely comes through in the exhibition. But also, I mean, you've also said before, Wouter, that Britain was also incredibly influential in this era internationally in terms of Newtown planning.
Yeah, because actually the first project that Sam and I worked together on was on was already in. We started to work together on that, I think 2001 or 2, something like that, was for a new town in Rotterdam called Hoogvliet. And then, so we did it in practice first. And we were working on a kind of a reconversion of that town. And it turned out that this town, this little new town hidden in the harbor area of Rotterdam, that's the building that Sam and Fat made with us as co-developers and clients, actually. This little town, this Hoogvliet, was actually made on the model of British new towns. Why? Because the British Council in 1946 had a traveling exhibition that traveled all around the world showing the new British modern planning principles. And they took that exhibition all around Europe, and then kind of that joined with Marshall Help funds also created a huge wave of new towns being designed in Europe, specifically in the Netherlands, that were very, very much inspired by English new towns.
But does it surprise you then to see the contemporary nervousness about planning, large-scale planning, public sector planning in this country particularly?
Yeah, amazing. Also, the funny thing that they said that, yeah, well, modernism, that's a foreign thing, and it's something imported by strange German people in the 20s. But we have always, we're nearly strange German people in the Netherlands. We have always seen England as the source of modern town planning. Ebenezer Howard, Patrick Abercrombie, the new towns, etc. England, but also later on the Architectural Association, etc. Archie Graham. For us, England has always been a source of modern town planning, and also the source of its dissolution or of its destruction in a way, or the destruction, you could nearly say, of the ideas behind it. Because of course Holland has also been affected by Thatcherism, etc. So it's strange that we look at England as the source, but maybe also of the grave.
And that's an undercurrent strongly in the catalogue too, Sam, with Owen Hatherley's work. I mean, clearly this stuff is connected to the welfare state, it's connected to a political project that looks to be at stake, let's say now, or at least dissolving. Is that part of the prompt for doing this project now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is a moment where I think the sort of legacy of the post-war period is being reassessed. And it's often being reassessed on really art historical terms, like suddenly brutalism is acceptable, or is fashionable, or is kind of even desirable at some level, which I think is interesting, but it's only interesting in that the same way that every changing of the guard fashion-wise is interesting, the same way that things which were scheduled, Victorian buildings which were scheduled for demolition, suddenly were saved and have become the bijou residences of the intelligentsia. The same is, I'm sure, happening with products of that period of the welfare state. The Balfron Tower, for example, moving into... but I think that the show, because it starts earlier than 1946, because it's not bound up with the welfare state as the only mechanism which can deliver planning. So one of the most important being the Garden City, which is maybe socialist in principle, but capitalist in the mechanism by which it delivers its ideals. And I think that seems to be interesting, and I think more productive, that there are other ways.
So sort of uncoupling this seemingly inevitable relationship between concrete and welfare state, nanny state, large government politics.
Yeah, and also, the questions which are at stake really how to build housing, how to build communities, how to make places which work for people. And those are questions which are intrinsically political, but they're not big P political. They're definitely social, but they might not be socialist. And that other formations which the exhibition looks at, which are all historical, which may be kind of radical squatting, but could also be development corporations, could also be local authorities, could also be
religious
companies, could also be
strange cults.
These are all systems, all methods of delivering different ways of kind of making places. And I think that at the moment there are questions that this is kind of up for grabs. This is on the political agenda. This week Nick Clegg talking about 5 new towns, maybe he described them as garden cities this time, I'm not sure, between Oxford and Cambridge along a new railway line where everyone will be incredibly intelligent and working in whether it's George Osborne walking around Ebbsfleet talking about it as a garden city, however little they may know what the phrase garden city actually means. But for the first time in quite a long time, there is a recognition that there is a pressing need for something, even if we're not sure what that something is, or the powers that be are not sure of what that might be. So I think the fact that we are able, through the fortunate occurrence of this particular Biennale, to resurrect a history of different ways in which Britain has imagined its future is really apposite, because that, I think, is the challenge which we have professionally, but I think much more importantly as a society. Yeah.
Are there any more questions at this point?
Looks as if I'm going to have to start going to Venice in even-numbered years as well as odd-numbered years. Thank you so much for that. Once every year, can I stand it? This account of Milton Keynes as a kind of modernist project, the images we've seen have mainly been out of the grid. It's like pleasingly wonky grid. Or it's been about the town centre, the city centre. But there's another Milton Keynes entirely, and I'm not sure whether we've got that, which is, as we romantically call them here, the grid squares, or in any other town it would be the villages, I suppose, the bits between the roads, which it's very difficult to characterise many of the newer ones as modernist undertakings. They're informal and squiggly, and okay, it's an attempt to reconstruct a country village or Legoland or whatever the heck they're doing in that red square. I just wonder whether I think the modernist account of Milton Keynes is only half the story, and not having seen the exhibition, I don't know
because of the
subsequent
development of the grid, you mean?
I don't know the history well enough, but I do know that contemporary MK and the villages within that, be unfair to characterise them in the same way that Milton Keynes characterised here.
I mean, I think there is embedded in the original vision of Milton Keynes. This image has always fascinated me. This is like the proposal for the new town of Milton Keynes, and the proposal is basically the image at the bottom. And I remember Derek telling me, he went for the interview for the job of chief architect, and they said, well, Derek, what will Milton Keynes look like? And he said, it will be greener than the landscape around it, or words to that effect. And of course, that's like an image which I think is summed up here beautifully. Like you build the town and then it disappears back into the landscape, which is perhaps, I think what makes Milton Keynes, perhaps, or the British kind of problem with modernism so interesting, is that it is both the future and the past at the same time. And of course there's different ways that can be manifested, like Poundbury, Prince Charles's pet urban planning project is another example of how the past and the future can merge. But I think the projects that we've looked at that have a very different attitude. They're not afraid to confront the past and the present. It's not born out of fear and repression. It's born out of I guess, a desire to fuse things into a new hybrid, new productive hybrids. So I mean, I think it's an interesting point, but I think, the tone of British modernism, because it always has this kind of picturesque desire deep in its heart, even when it's trying to be its most rational, I think is really interesting, and that is the kind of the result, certainly, of us putting British planning on the couch.
But in a way, what you are describing, it is also one of the weaknesses, in a way, of Milton Keynes, not its concept, but what you see, what I found interesting when I started visiting Milton Keynes is that the original idea, the road grid, would never really separate things from each other. The road grid would also connect things to each other, so things could flow. I mean, then in an urban way, things could flow into each other. One village could. The people of one village could do their shopping in the or not village, but then of course the road grid turned out to be much more of a division than the original planners, maybe in their naivete then, or their optimism about the effects of the automobile on towns. They became much more, and of course the famous roundabouts, I don't think they were in the original plans. I don't think roundabouts were a kind of a tool to manage the traffic that came in a little bit later. So I think the fact that entire parts of Milton Keynes can lead a nearly secret existence, and I think in a way that is an outcome that was not foreseen, I don't think, by the planners, and. But it also depends on which scale you look at it. Huh? I think that this very, very kind of strong road grid is, of course, a very modernist idea of town planning, and then it allows for things that happen within it to become squiggly and neo-traditionalist. So, but I think it's a type of planning that has left open gigantic holes, which in a way is very good.
Sorry.
Just in that word, vision, there's quite a lot of kind of flaws in that, because we're kind of putting that higher than that kind of ground level of kind of those social, political kind of, aspects that are so important. And I think, Sam, you said something interesting at the beginning, that architecture is often seen quite separately, which I thought was really interesting, because for me that seems completely bonkers. Why would it be separate? And I just wonder if some of these kind of visionary kind of statements that we made at that time, kind of one reason why they did fail was that we didn't kind of plan in that kind of lower level of kind of organising things. So for example, the Red Road flats in Glasgow, one kind of huge mistake was just not having a reception at the beginning, not organising how to use these spaces. This kind of idea of vision doesn't seem quite. It seems like a dream, and I think also if I was, because I don't have an architectural kind of background, so I'm an artist, so if I was to kind of humanise this kind of idea of snaking between the past and the future, I would think there was something completely missing in my present, because that's what you do, don't you? If you're not having a good time in your present, you just snake. And that's kind of interesting as well. Like, well, we tried, why did that happen at that time? Was it because we were just trying to find a kind of British modernity, and that's why we had to say, because we didn't have our identity?
I think that's a really interesting point. Maybe it hasn't come up talking to our patients before, that they were somehow kind of daydreaming about happier days or possible futures. But I think that the way we've tried to use the word vision, the visions that we've tried to summon, are visions which are actually incredibly sincere visions. Now, they may have failed, like Hume, for example, is a case in point. It was a disaster, absolute disaster. But I think, on the one hand, that because they possessed a vision, I think, as compared to the way in which development happens now, which is vision-less. I think that the vision leaves something, whether it was right or wrong, whether it was fully carried out, whether it worked. I don't think that's necessarily important. I think everything will fail, every utopia will collapse, every form of architectural idealism will not deliver what it wants to or what it promised to. But I think that the point of the vision is that it articulates something which is much more important. This isn't like just an image. This isn't simply marketing. Although in some cases, in the case of Milton Keynes, its marketing was incredibly sophisticated. But it wasn't.
So that the difficulty there is kind of steering that vision architecturally, but being able to kind of view it like marketing as well. Maybe that's where we kind of.
I think it's a very, very good point, actually, because you see that actually that only in the late 50s, early 60s did a very, very small group of English architects also try to understand the actual world around them, which is like the independent group they try to actually, not instead of being very exalted about future visions or past visions, they try to understand, for example, Bethnal Green, how that exactly worked, working with photographers like Nigel Henderson to really understand the present. And I think that to be visionary in the sense that you can dream or that you can kind of have this heightened imagination about things, and to do that on the basis of what you actually see around you and the way that people are actually living their lives and the things that they are actually going through. I think you're absolutely right that has always been a weakness of modernism in a way, but again, at the same time, modernism has also constantly tried to do that, sometimes very clumsily. But for example, I think the non-plan project by Peter Hall and Rainer Bannon was exactly that they said, why don't we experimentally take away all planning visions, or for them it was more like planning bureaucracy, liberate parts of the English countryside of it, and then just see what happens if people can just project what they actually want and what they are actually doing on it. And of course we have to also remember, like now you say, yeah, now we can see what the result is of that. But of course that was before we were so rudely confronted with the fact that it would be just large corporations who would fill the whole landscape.
And traffic jams.
And traffic jams. Well, there's a little bit of that there. So
we had we're running out of time, so I'm going to take. There was one more point at the front here. Yes, that gentleman here.
Do you think our relationship with modernism would be different if all the developments of the 60s had been built perfectly?
No, I don't think so. I think it's very difficult to define perfectly, because I think most of the problems that they met, or not most, let's say a large part of the problems that these developments were confronted with were not intrinsically attached to how they were built. I think they were attached to the fact, so maybe to something that you said, you just said, that maybe some of the decisions or the way that these buildings were made and the way that decisions were made in order to make them, maybe they were not embedded enough in society. So I think if the people would have been much more connected to the way that these projects had been built, then maybe the alienation that happened there maybe would not have been so great. So I think it has a lot to do with the social kind of perception and the social realities, of course, of how these buildings did. And of course, because then these physical, technical problems would have been solved. Then people would have taken them up and solved them. But somehow there was no will to solve them at the moment that they needed to be solved.
We're at 8:30. I think we probably have to wrap it up. But really, thank you so much all for listening, but mainly thanks to Wouter for an amazing exhibition and a wonderful presentation.